welcome, Maggie, to Where the Climate Things Are. This is such a joy to have you. Oh my goodness.
Thank you so much, Addie. I'm so excited that I get to hang out with you for the next hour. Dream come true to
This is
reconnect.
truly a dream, truly a dream. And we won't say how many years. We just noted that it's been since we've seen or hung out with each other, but it's been a lot of years, and this is a long time coming. But it's been so fun to follow your career since we met way back when at Ashoka, which we'll get into. But I was curious if you could start off by introducing yourself in whatever way you want to take that to the audience.
Sure. Well, I'm so delighted to be here. I love the podcast. Love that you're having these wonderful conversations around climate and all the different ways that we can come to it. My name is Maggie Lemere, and I'm a documentary filmmaker, an oral historian, and a storytelling strategist more broadly. And I work generally on stories about how humanity relates to the environment. So that can look like a lot of different things that I'm happy to go into later. I'm also a National Geographic explorer and have been doing some projects with Nat Geo in the past few years.
Amazing. And traveling all over the world, even scheduling a time to chat for both of us, obviously, definitely on both ends of travel, but you have been all over the place, many different countries. I'm so excited to dive into some of your film projects that you're working on. Um, Before we do that, as I mentioned, I ask folks, and you've maybe heard when you've listened to the podcast, I ask folks about their awakening or aha moment around climate and environment. And again, that's also kind of, you can take that as you will, broadly defined. But I'm curious what that was for you as someone that's known you for a while, but never talked about this with you. What was that aha moment around climate for you?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Addie. And I don't know if you've experienced the same phenomenon, but it seems like a lot of the people I've worked with in different capacities on different issues over the years, we've all sort of ended up in climate, or many of us have ended up in climate
Yeah,
without necessarily having had the conversation. And so
right.
I was thinking about this question, and I actually don't think there, I mean, I think it was a lot of aha moments, a lot of life-changing
Yeah.
experiences that kept kind of pushing me in this direction of making my filmmaking and oral history work really centered around climate. But I think for me, my background is doing a lot of human rights and environmental work and sort of looking at how those two things intersect. So even, back in the day when I was in high school, I was part of a Sierra Club and Amnesty International campaign called Defend the
Oh, yeah.
Defenders, which was all about, helping protect the human rights of people who are advocating for the rights of the forest and that kind of thing. And I think, growing up in this time, or coming of age in this time and being involved in these issues, it just became more and more present. And so the work just sort of naturally began to integrate it more. But for me, it's always been from the angle of how communities have experienced it and what they're centering and experiencing. And so I think my work just sort of naturally started to include that as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And that's such a good call. I've noticed that too, Maggie, where so many people that we've worked with in various ways around kind of broadly like social impact or community work have I've seen kind of pop up in various ways in the environmental space. And like when we were both so we both worked at Ashoka together, which is an organization supporting social entrepreneurs all over the world, among other things. There's a lot that Ashoka does. But I was not specifically focused on environment. And I didn't really start focusing on environment till I went to grad school, and even halfway through grad school had my aha moment and like shifted towards climate and environment studies. And so and it's funny because I do have a couple of friends, and some of them I've interviewed for the podcast, where they to me are like the people that were in environment like from the start or whatever. Like they've studied, they really studied this even in undergrad or kind of beforehand and were really passionate about it. And then there are a lot of us that I think to your point, it has emerged in our work that this is one of, if not the defining issues of our time, and it impacts everything and it cross-cuts everything. And so
Exactly.
it really does feel like it's like a natural, it's so interesting to hear you say that. Like, yeah, as our work has progressed, it's like we have to include that in our conversation. We have to be talking about the way that the climate is changing because it's undeniably inextricably linked with everything.
Yeah, and so many of the fights or the struggles that I've been involved in as a filmmaker, as an activist, advocate, they may be about stopping some extractive project, but that, of
Mm-hmm.
course, that ties back to climate. The primary concern might be like pollution or human rights and displacement, but that's also a climate story. So climate connects to everything, and I think the beautiful and maybe also the challenging part at times is it is really global and it's everywhere. And so we also are experiencing it in our own lives. And so I think there's an opportunity, from a storytelling perspective to use stories to invite people into the conversation. And even if it's telling stories about other places, there's of course resonances with what we're all experiencing where we are too. And so I can think
Yeah.
back, not about necessarily one aha moment, but just seeing the environment change where I grew up, or my first time experiencing a wildfire and all of these different things, right? And then also, like for me, there's been moments of working on a film about young people who are fighting the climate crisis and their stories of having been through climate catastrophes and then having an embodied experience of seeing a wildfire and having fear and realizing it's not this external thing.
Yeah.
It's a deeply embodied experience now for all of us, not just like a professional pursuit,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll actually, because I've hinted at it, I'll share. I was saying to you before we started recording that I hadn't actually shared my aha moment, or I hadn't even
yeah.
reflected on my own. But it relates to a lot of what you're saying. It was actually when I was making a film series for UNDP, United Nations Development Program, which was during grad school. I was able to be a field producer on this like short, very short films, like not even document. I mean, it was like 5 minutes or something, kind of highlighting different indigenous communities around the world for this prize called the Equator Prize, which awarded indigenous peoples and local communities all over the world with these like, yes, a stipend, but also kind of a platform to speak about their work on climate action. And I'm lugging camera. This is like, I love telling you this as someone who I've looked up to for so long in the film space, as I have to you. Like, I was like lugging this camera gear all over the world, Micronesia, Indonesia,
So
Ecuador.
cool.
And
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about what I was doing. Like, it was very much like to say it was a hands-on learning experience or like a sink or swim learning experience was
It's
real,
the way
because
to
if
do
you
it,
didn't get the
Addie.
shot, in Borneo, you're like kind of screwed. Um, but it was just, I mean, it's what you said about this isn't like an academic or professional thing or a headline. Like, it became so real for me, but not until I was literally like recording and sitting behind the camera of an interview with an indigenous leader or a community activist who was talking about preventing palm oil companies
Mm.
from coming into, yeah, what the area of Borneo that we were in, Putu Sibau area, and it was just, it sort of, yeah, there were various aha moments, but it was this way of realizing like, these are people, these are their lives, this is not a new thing, this is like their forever struggle. Or even asking a community in Micronesia, like, tell me about the ridge to reef program that you've, and they're like, what do you mean? Like, we just protect our coral reefs. Or like, it was sort of this like, yeah, we just do this because this is our, how we've done it since time immemorial and for years. And like, it's not, I don't know, it felt very like I was coming in with my sort of like academic hat on, and they were kind of like, girl, listen in. Let's tell you about like how we've always done this and how we're protecting the land every day. So yeah, that was my aha moment, and it was film related to
Oh,
our
I love
theme.
that.
Yeah.
What you're speaking of, it points to something I've been thinking a lot about recently with some of my own storytelling work and some talks I've been giving about kind of climate storytelling recently, which is
Yeah.
that so often things are presented as this big story or this avalanche of facts, as people might describe it in these,
Sure.
UN reports and the conversation about parts per million and whatever, but really
Mm-hmm.
it's the little intimate moments that we live and experience that are like where this is known. There's some incredible Pacific climate activists and writers who I'm happy to point you all to, who talk about the intimacy of the small moment for climate. And something I'm interested in is how do we help us all connect to those and understand them and experience them and process them, because I think it's those small moments that are where the reality of it is for most of us, and
Yeah.
connecting that to the ability to feel it, understand it, and then make change. To me, your story is an example of a small moment of the intimacy that sometimes is left
Yeah.
out of this climate conversation, which is so
Yeah.
important. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, that's I would love to point people in that direction more too, because and we'll share links in the show notes, et cetera, because I think you are a wealth of resources and knowledge on this topic, as I know and as folks are learning right now. I'm curious, Maggie. So we met, as I mentioned, at an organization called Ashoka, and I'll like try not to like fangirl too much, but like when I met you, Maggie, it was just an immediate like, okay, I need to come work at this organization because this girl is so badass and does so many amazing things in the film world. Like I had really not, I don't think I think I'd like idolized filmmakers, and like there weren't many women that I'd met that made films, or were producers. And then I met you, and you were not only a filmmaker, producer, storyteller, but you were also someone who was talking about these topics, right? Not just like a sports film or like, I don't know. Like, I just feel like I hadn't met like sort of social activist storytellers like yourself. And I was wondering, in that vein, if you could talk about, like, take us back a little bit. How did you get into filmmaking? I know there are a lot more women, I think, in the space now, but I'm curious if you were like not seeing so many women when you started out, how that felt. And it was just, yeah, I would love to explore your background as you got into the film space and talk a little bit more about your journey into becoming a filmmaker, even before I met you.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I think I was very much becoming a filmmaker when we met. So it's amazing to hear that you thought I was
That's how,
impressive because I
oh,
really
yes.
definitely didn't know what I was doing, but I was learning as I went, just like you were.
Well, I couldn't
Um,
tell. Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, when I think about filmmaking and storytelling, I think so much of it is having interesting stories to tell, new perspectives to share, new ways, of collaborating with communities and bringing out new ideas. And to me, that is, as if not more important than like the technical side, which was the side I didn't have as much experience in when I started. And I honestly learned by fundraising for pitching projects and getting them um, greenlit to make them happen, including a thought job that we had together at Ashoka, where I was like, maybe I can convince these people to give me money to like make films. And I did that for a
Yeah.
little bit. And it was a great platform to then leave and go freelance and pursue this, crazy career of being an independent filmmaker. Um, but yeah, prior to that, I'd always worked on human rights, environment. My background before Ashoka was working with a lot of environmental nonprofits. Always it kind of had an intersection with the human rights piece. So Earth Rights International, Global Witness, looking at how the environment could be causing harm and devastation, or also how it could be used to create and generate solutions both. But I found that in a lot of my traditional media advocacy work, I was in the position of trying to get like short quotes from people or, visit them to have something they were saying kind of confirm or affirm a story that my organization wanted to do. And I understand why, but I didn't feel like I really had this space to explore in-depth, complicated stories that would, lead me to have more questions, more shades of gray, a more nuanced worldview. And I was seeking deeper relationship with people, longer term projects, and more collaborative projects where participants could be much more involved in shaping the narrative, shaping the storytelling process, and what would happen with those tools. And so I previously published a book, which was a great experience, but it was 500 pages, really, really draining. I realize not
Wow.
everyone reads books, of course. I feel like we're in this age of media. Um, so I was like, I think I want to be a filmmaker because it's so much more collaborative. I wanted to work with a team. I'd always loved photography. And so I just kind of, I don't know, like muscled, elbowed, whatever it is, my way into it by having ideas, I think. And I think that was because had been involved in activism, for lack of a better word, for many years, and really cared about issues and cared about helping people connect more deeply or differently than maybe they'd been able to with the kinds of stories we had predominantly seen. So that's sort of how I got into it. And Ashoka was a great platform to start doing some of that and getting some of that experience. And then, leaving Ashoka, I did freelance work, but I really started to, get into the industry of, working on my first feature and independent projects. And honestly, that's been a really long process that I'm still sort of
Yeah,
like, I don't know when you're no longer an emerging filmmaker, but I
totally.
still feel like I'm
Yeah.
emerging for whatever that's worth. But obviously getting the support of, National Geographic and other institutions like Tribeca and Doc Society, it's helpful. And you're like, it's
Yeah.
still so hard. So it's a
Sure.
long journey. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about that. I mean, I think that, like, of course, I'm very familiar with Doc Society and Tribeca, but Nat Geo feels like probably the most familiar to many folks who are listening. I mean, I was curious, both like what we started to touch on is how did climate and environmental themes really start to emerge? I know you said you were working on environmental themes throughout your filmmaking career, but it does seem like a lot of our like fellow Ashoka folks or other folks that we know in, the social impact space have all kind of, myself included, have all been like, we need to be talking about climate. Like, this topic is the thing. And I just was curious, like, after you left Ashoka, after, as you started to freelance and do more storytelling, how did those themes start to come in? I mean, it seems like it was almost, again, like you couldn't ignore it. Like, it was just they were there and we had to tell these stories. But I'm curious because that will lead us to your current work, which I know is like has a lot of climate themes. But just how did environment start to come into your storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, where my mind goes a little bit with this is growing up. And I grew up next to a national park, a national forest. My dad's an outdoor guide and a naturalist. And so I was really lucky to grow up really immersed in the natural world. And it was one of my profound loves. And I think one of the motivations also to do human rights work, actually, because I kind of grew up with a framework of everyone and everything being interconnected ecologically, which kind of formed like a spiritual worldview. And I think, part of what I started to feel with a lot of advocacy work, I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this in the best way, is, working on a campaign or an issue or an action started to feel like, while extremely important for me, started to feel like it could be a bit transactional. And what I wanted to explore and do as a storyteller was help create possibilities of shifting how we relate to the natural world, including people. And so I think for me, storytelling was a space I could do that, and that I could invite others to do that, particularly with the environment, maybe because as the crisis, not only the climate, all of these things are related, but the mass extinction that we're going through. I'm such an animal lover, and I've always been so
Yeah.
tender about animals. I
Yeah.
was like, how I think all the policies and structural systemic changes that are needed, we also fundamentally, as I think humans, need to change how we just relate to other life, how we see and experience it, or aware of what's around us. And so I became
Yeah.
interested in essentially doing environmental storytelling with communities that held that knowledge and those perspectives, and working to highlight that and also protect and defend that as a precious and vital part of our planetary ecosystem today. So that's like, I think for me, kind of
Yeah.
where it evolved from, and that drew me to some of, all the projects I work on, of course, are very different, but working a lot also in partnership with Indigenous communities, that's been part of it. So for me, I think that was like
Yes.
kind of bringing these different threads together of what felt nourishing and what I felt could potentially be nourishing to others and important in this moment of crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so many ways to go with this. I'm so excited. So before we go forward, though, I want to go back again when you were talking about your childhood. this is a podcast with the thesis that, or sort of the through line, that outdoor recreation is a not that everyone needs to identify as an outdoor recreator or even enjoy spending time outside, but the thesis is sort of like those that do really love to be outside in nature might want to also protect it, might have like that extra level of passion for specific areas and specific, pieces of land or areas of water, that kind of thing. So I was curious, you did grow up, and I'm even asking this, I was like, I know some of this, but I don't know all of it. I was curious if you could talk about your relationship to being outside in the natural world. I think when we emailed at one point, you were saying you were going to the Boundary Waters, or maybe that was part of one of where, like, I don't remember if that's where you grew up, but tell us more about what it means to be outside and to be in nature for you. And that can be in any form of recreation, or it can just be like, this is what I love to do, is just sit outside. I think some people feel they're like, I'm not a real athlete, or I'm not a recreator, and I'm like, yes, just because you're not a professional sponsored trail runner or whatever, there's sort of these like funny comparisons people make. But yeah, what does outdoor recreation mean to you, and how has it shaped your
Hmm.
life?
So many great questions, Addie. I had to think about
Too
where to
many
start it as
questions.
well.
Yeah.
No, we have very similar interviewing styles. I'm like, here, I'll just toss up a bunch, and then you can decide. You can decide which one. I do literally the exact same thing. Um, yeah, okay. So growing up, I grew up outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, next to Shenandoah National Park in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Some of the oldest mountains on the planet, often get snubbed by the West Coasters, but I will always defend them.
Yeah, definitely
Um,
do.
but yeah, I think, having the Appalachian Trail essentially be, what I considered my backyard, I really became connected to a community of living things. And I think that was, as I kind of mentioned, fundamental to shaping my worldview and how I learned how to see and feel and experience. And that's something I'm interested in, helping provide access for others to. I think, the most powerful thing we can do is create direct in-person experiences, but maybe the second best thing is transformative storytelling experiences. And
Mm,
um, so yeah, I think that environment, and having, in particular, a mom who's an educator and a dad who's a naturalist. So they're both educators who taught me about flowers and plants and, trees and animals and clouds. It had this aliveness to me and the sacredness. And I feel really lucky to feel such an intense connection to I always feel like the land raised me. And I think that's really special. And it gives me a sense of a foundation and a sense of home that, as you mentioned, I travel all over the world. I was just in 10 countries in the past month for work.
wow.
But whenever I come home and I see those blue ridges, I have a sense of home and a sense of place and the values of that place. And interestingly, I think if you're from, a more mountain or more rural community, potentially, you realize that there's these powerful things that connect people across difference. And one of them is love of place, love of land, and what you will
Mm,
do to defend that. And I think that understanding of how much I love my place has helped me connect with people who love and want to protect their place. And that's been a powerful way to relate to some of the communities I'm in partnership working on projects from Myanmar to Palestine to different places
yeah.
in the US. So I would say, like, first, it's kind of honestly like an emotional and a spiritual experience for me of going home and being in the mountains and feeling connected to the place that I'm from. And because my dad is an outdoor guide and I got to go on fabulous adventures, not only in the
Yeah.
Blue Ridge Mountains, but, all over, that I was very lucky to gain a confidence. Like, I always said I knew how to like read a river or read a trail really well, but I would go to New York
Yeah.
City, and even though it's like a grid, I feel really overwhelmed and confused. Even to this day,
Yep.
it's like not
Relatable.
intuitive. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was able to kind of have this confidence of being in the outdoor world. And so now, like, when I want to refill my cup, Like for me, it's my daily walks with my dog in whatever woods I have
Yeah.
access to. Here in DC, it's Rocky Park, where I can see osprey and
Yeah.
bald eagles and so many incredible species that people don't know are right here. But it's also going on for me like a lot of backpacking trips all over the world with my friends and trying to get off the grid. And I love to kind of like suffer and struggle, backpacking. It's just like it makes you have to be so present. But that feeling of getting to like a beautiful view or having accomplished what you can with your body is part of how I love to relate, and just kind of being in the elements and feeling like my humanness in that way that's like not on a computer. I also paddle and love kayaking and love being on the river. I've been out twice this week. And it's been great to see, the migrating birds. But for me, like my outdoor experiences are very much like nature experiences.
Yeah.
And then like the benefit of like the physical challenge is also important, but it hasn't, yeah, definitely not a professional athlete. So,
No, no.
yeah.
The 99.9% of people listening are not also. So I love that, Maggie. And I'm just smiling thinking about, do you paddle in DC? It
I
sounds like
do.
you go out and
Yeah.
paddle in the river. Okay, that's so cool. I love that. I wish I'd done that when I lived there. Sounds really
We'll go when you
peaceful.
come back.
No, we
Yeah,
should go.
it is
Yeah.
really crazy that you can just go up the river north and all of a sudden like it's so much quieter and there's like these
Yeah.
little islands in the river. And last week I was paddling and everything on the banks of the river was in bloom, so it was kind of like this scent paddle of like smelling the flowers. And
Whoa.
then there were like all these osprey, probably saw like 20 osprey, and just in 2 hours you can have a total like little nature fill your cup experience. So it's
Yeah.
really
I
nice.
love that. Right in DC. That was something that I loved about living there too, was once I found Rock Creek Park, it was a different experience for me. Like that
Totally.
changed everything about the city for me. And I actually got into trail running when I lived in DC, like actually through that running group I used to do that was like on the mall and not a trail running group. But some people were like, "Oh, I'm doing this trail race this weekend." I was like, "What's that?" Like I'd done a little bit of it, but anyways, it was Rock Creek
Yeah.
Park was very transformative for me in that
Oh, I
regard. I was
love
like, "Oh,
that.
these are trails. This is really fun." Yeah. And I think a lot of listeners will identify with the idea of what you said about with backpacking. Like there's that physical challenge. There's the like suffering a little bit, right? Of like you kind of go through some things that are away from your computer that are in the natural world. And I think that's what brings a lot of the outdoor recreation community together, is that sense of like kind of liking to like do hard things in the wild, and suffer a little bit. And then and the of course
100%.
the like with the trail ahead, the other podcast that I host, we talk a lot about like the privileges of being able to like choose to do that and being like
Yeah.
that. But I think that is something that, again, I'm hoping that the community here in the outdoors, it's no secret. I mean, this is, yeah, it's not like a thing I'm uncovering. It's just I'm trying to uplift stories in this space that are, folks who are working on climate or working on environmentalism in some ways, that are also like, yeah, I also love, of course, to be outside, because that's like, I wanted to protect those spaces.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and the two can be really interrelated. So having my dad be a guide, I would, kind of be his junior guide assistant when he would lead backpacking trips,
Yeah.
often
So
in West
cool.
Virginia. And he would bring people out who had never been out before, who didn't have that
Yeah.
confidence, didn't have the comfort, and maybe
Yep.
hadn't had the opportunity, like they had the interest, but hadn't had the opportunity to develop that ease in the
Hmm.
natural world. And he would just curate ways for people to feel comfortable or invite them to sit outside and look at the Milky Way. And you would see
Wow.
that literally change people's lives. So I
Yeah.
think, for those of us who are in the outdoor recreation community, which I do consider myself a part of it, it's like, a big part
Yeah.
of my life. Finding ways to bring others in, and whether it's
Totally.
like your professional job or not. Now I'm actually doing some
Hmm.
guiding with National Geographic, and that's been such a an
Cool.
honor, particularly working in the Serengeti. A lot of people have never been to that part of the world, have never gotten to see, these landscapes, and it's actually life changing for people to be brought in,
Yeah,
you know, to be supported.
definitely.
And so I feel like there's these
Yeah.
cool intersections that can happen.
The invitation, right? Of like, and the access piece. Cause I think those trips, from what I know, like really open up like, you know, a possibility for folks who maybe would never have thought about going to these wild spaces, but then they see a trip that's curated and they're able to sort of say, like, actually, I think I could see myself going on something like that. Are these okay, wait, talk more about this. Are these like photo trips? Like, do you teach photography? Tell us more about your guiding with Nat Geo. That's so cool.
Every trip is different. And so in my role in the Serengeti trips, I work in the Great Migration trip for Nat Geo expeditions. And it's my role is to actually help teach people who are going probably primarily to see the animals more about the people and the context and the contemporary conservation, sustainability stories and challenges. And so, to Nat Geo's credit, they have me there to sort of help deepen that experience because ideally people walk away transformed and thinking also about the connections to, you know, we can talk about challenges with wildlife corridors in the Serengeti, but we have the same challenges, you know, in the
Yeah.
US, of course.
Right.
A lot of the model of national parks that we've developed in the US has been translated into everywhere, including
Yeah.
sub-Saharan Africa. And for me, it's like really interesting to delve into this idea of are there spaces that are just for like animals and just for people? And is that a good thing or bad thing? And so I sort of help create conversations around like what is the future of conservation. And then I get to geek out and ride around, look at the animals with everyone. But every trip
So
is a little
cool.
different. So often they will have a photography expert, but as a
Mhm.
filmmaker, I'm not usually, I wouldn't be that person,
Right.
although I help. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I wondered about that. That's because I've heard of these trips before and I've heard them more in the context of, yeah, like learning photography in a very cool space or maybe photographing animals, to your point.
Yeah.
But that's so cool. Gosh, what Nat Geo chose so well. You're like the person for this, Maggie. Like you are the one to
Thank
deepen
you.
the experience. Oh my gosh, I'm just hearing
I
this and
love
being
it.
like, yes,
It's a pinch
this is so
myself. Like
good.
I'm so excited I get to go be there, and you know, like Tanzania was the first place that I really wanted to go, and I went and did a NOLS course. So actually, talking about the outdoor world, I did
Yeah.
a semester of NOLS where we got to go across the Serengeti by foot and go up Kili, but go around all the sides. You know, we carried our own stuff, hence the like suffering. And so
Yeah.
getting to really know that landscape for several months and like make some of my best friends um, there, it's just been like so sweet to have this full circle to because I think, you know, as a storyteller, the word expert, for example, is not one that I really
Mm,
love, but I think, you know, we're in the position of being able to interweave themes and help people ask about new questions, including climate, you know, when they're on these trips. And I'll ask like,
yeah.
our Tanzanian absolutely incredible wildlife guides to talk about climate and how it's impacting where we are. So I sort of help like
Yeah.
tee up a lot of that stuff. Yeah.
Totally. Oh my gosh. This like you specifically are someone in my life who does not say like of course you're not going to be like I'm so cool I did this thing, but like you're so cool. Like Maggie, you are just like I love it. You're like I did a Knowles course where I walked across the Serengeti. Anyways, I just, you know, I'll just be here to like
Thanks,
be your
Addie.
hype
I think
woman on
you're
the
very cool too, obviously. Yeah, no, I
No,
think,
I
you
love
know,
it.
I'm so grateful, right, to be able to be, because the reality is when you're someone who's very much driven by your values, your passions, wanting to work in human rights, environment, climate, and make stories, usually you're not going to have like a job or an
Right.
institution, right? You're kind of like
Yeah.
random. And I've always been that way. Like, I think the only office job I've ever had was the job we had
As a
together.
sugar.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it's Ashoka.
totally.
And that's like,
Totally.
was a pretty informal office job as far as office jobs went. Um, And so
Yeah.
I remember when I got my first grant from National Geographic, and I didn't even know you became a quote unquote explorer at first. I was like, oh, it's a mistake. Like, what is this? Um, honestly. But I remember feeling like, oh, like someone said, like, oh, you always seem so random. This is actually a childhood friend, but now you make more sense. And I was like, okay, I guess that's good. The reality
Thank
is like
you.
day to day, it's still kind of random, because you're still always having to figure it
Yeah.
out. But it is really
Sure.
nice to get some like validation as you go, for sure.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I know this about you because I worked with you in that informal office setting, which it was. Although the office itself, let's be real, not the best. Not the best. Really
No, we
tough.
never
Tough
wanted to
environment.
be in Westland, did we?
We never wanted to be out there. It was really
No.
tough. All
The
it was
only
like
part,
all
the
these
only good part was
outdoorsy
taking Knob
people.
Creek to go there. Yeah.
Exactly. It was all these outdoorsy people commuting to this like 70s style, like
No,
old school office building high
yeah,
rise. And we were all like,
terrible.
what are we doing
No
here? We were like
windows.
some people from the Peace Corps. Yeah, exactly. It's like really tough. Um uh okay, wow. I would love to ask you more about what you're working on now. And I feel like that's like many things. But you just were traveling in 10 countries and you're actually coming up to Seattle, you said, in the near future to work with some Indigenous communities here. I was just curious if you could tell us more about all the projects you have going on right now.
Yeah, let's see where to start.
Where to
Um,
start?
where to start? So I guess I'll talk about the first project that National Geographic funded or helped fund by giving me a grant, an Explorer grant, which is a feature film I've been making set in the northern West Bank of Palestine, which follows a cooperative of Palestinian olive farmers who use regenerative agriculture. And they work with olive trees that are hundreds and sometimes thousands of years old. And so it's a story about this beautiful tradition of the people taking care of the trees, seeing them like they're their children, and passing them between the generations. And how, for a while, this whole tradition, this whole culture, and legacy of stewardship was really at risk. And it still is at risk, actually, for many reasons. But there was an incredible, actually, Palestinian social entrepreneur who decided to try to organize his community to save the olive crop. And they created an association with 2,000 families. So in the film, I
Wow.
follow these farmers and kind of explore how, by re-wedding themselves to the trees, they've been able to find new, I guess, sources of mental, spiritual, economic support during both the climate crisis and the political crisis and war that they're living through.
Yeah.
So kind of how
Yeah.
nature can sustain them, and I think more universally us in these times
Mm,
of crisis.
mm.
So it's a story of their relationship
Wow.
to the trees and an environmental portrait and a story of beauty in a place that we don't get to see. So that's my feature film that I'm just about to finish
Wow.
editing. And it follows,
Congrats.
a constellation of characters. Because for me, one thing that felt really important was to not have it be about one hero, but
Yeah,
understanding how an ecosystem of people and communities work together to make change. So that's
absolutely.
the Olive Farmer film.
Wow. When does
um,
that, can I ask that question? When is it like coming to the world, do you think? We don't
Gosh, it's
know.
the biggest mystery with filmmaking. You never
Okay. Yeah, no,
really
I know.
know. But it's
That's
set
why I
over
hesitated to ask.
7 years, so I'm really hoping it will
Wow,
be,
Maggie.
yeah, that was like a pretty soon after Ashoka type of thing. And,
Yeah, it
back
must
to
have
the
been.
earlier theme of the conversation, it was so interesting, when I went to Palestine for the first time, I'd always been involved to some extent on issues related to Palestine and interested, but I didn't really know what my way or my role of contributing was. And when I went to the West Bank, there's these beautiful mountains that look just to me in so many ways like home in the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Wow.
And to be with people on their land who are shepherding or picking thyme or taking care of their trees. And I studied Arabic in college, but I don't really speak it. And so I found this universal resonance because of our love of place that created something of a connection that I think helped me navigate how I would help facilitate sharing the story. So anyways, back to your question. I
Wow.
think it will
Oh,
come out maybe, I think it will premiere this summer, hopefully, like
we
late
can
summer. Yeah.
we can all of these also all of these projects we can link to like the most up-to-date version and where people can find more information
Thank
about everything.
you.
But
Yeah, it sounds
congratulations,
amazing.
that is really exciting. And I know like final touches on editing, picture lock, it's all really exciting times. And especially after a 7-year process, which good
Yeah.
on you. That's really incredible.
Making an independent film, it is hard, you know, and doing so
Yeah.
through COVID and
Right.
conflict. It's definitely the hardest thing I've ever worked on. So I hope, you
Wow.
know, my core hope is to make the community proud and then to help tell a story that generates impact, yeah, for them.
Especially right now during what's happening there. I think
Yeah,
it's like it's another, I feel like this phrase is so used right now, but the like now more than ever, but this specific conversation now more than ever, it's like we also need to open up the aperture on storytelling around Palestinian communities and like what the beauty of, you know, the relationship to land and everything that you've just
exactly.
talked about. Like we really need to share that. So thank you so much for working on that. Thank you
Yeah,
for
and
doing this.
you know, because of this really geographically small place, you know, occupies a huge part of our imagination, but it's often tragically through these images of violence and
Right.
destruction. I'm really hopeful about elevating a group of environmental, you know, change makers, to use Ashoka's speak, or
Yes.
leaders, and the
Yeah.
types of people and communities that ultimately deeply deserve to be invested in and uplifted, and the way that they take care of their land is like going back again to that earlier part of like how do we relate to nature is something that I think is so profound and so beautiful and something that everyone can learn from. And it's just a story that most of us, you know, Palestinians know the story well, but
Right.
most of us don't know. And so excited to like
Yeah.
help people see the beauty and what's so important to protect.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's so cool. So
Yeah.
this is one of many projects though that you have going on. Is that correct? Like this is sort
Yes.
of, I feel like the life of a freelance filmmaker. You're like working on 5 things at once, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the one that I mean, I think that the film, the feature film about the farmers certainly has a lot of climate themes because
Yeah.
it's a lot about their stewardship and how olive trees are so drought resistant, but how regenerative farming helps with the crisis and that kind of thing. But the most kind of direct project I have right now that deals with the climate crisis is called Versus Goliath, and that's actually premiering this coming week in Denver. Um,
That's
and it
right.
yeah, so it is a doc series that's supported by Fossil Free Media in Patagonia that is about frontline communities. But really, what I mean by that is just everyday Americans who
Yeah.
are experiencing the impacts of the oil and gas industry and who are trying to like fight back to protect their communities as well as transform them for a better future. And so in this project, we follow, you know, people who aren't your quote unquote like stereotypical environmentalists like Greenpeace tree huggers, but a former
Yeah.
oil and gas worker, an army vet, a church
Wow.
leader, you know, a rodeo cowboy. And yeah, it's
Wow.
been such a pleasure to work on these stories, a series, and see, you know, how this is both impacting so many different people, but how so many different people across the US from so many different backgrounds frame and understand an issue like climate. And often it's a lot more intimate and immediate, right, to their daily lives and daily existence and health, right? And in
Yeah.
Appalachia, where one of our episodes is, there's a giant fracked gas pipeline being built and a lot of the communities there drink their water from springs, you know, that they've relied on for
Wow.
thousands, hundreds or thousands of years. People have
Yeah.
just drank from water there. But now, if there's an explosion or a leak, that water source would go away. And so, you know, it's these really like immediate intimacies of how life has been
Mm.
transformed. You know, with the U.S. being despite all of the wonderful things that we could celebrate from the Biden administration and the Inflation Reduction Act, like we are the largest, oil and gas producer in the world. And there are people who are living
Yeah.
on the fence lines and the front lines of that who are
Yeah.
suffering from the impacts of that disproportionately.
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
Wow, that sounds like an incredible series. You said that's premiering this coming week. And that's what
yeah,
you're flying to Denver
yeah,
for. Okay, amazing.
yes,
That's so exciting.
yeah.
That will be very how many what like how many parts is the series?
There's 4 episodes. And one of the things that's cool about this project, and I think important, you'll appreciate this from an Ashoka perspective too,
Yes.
um, is it's not just about like individual communities and individual stories, but actually how ultimately they all intersect. Because the
Mm,
industries often are the same ones all over the country. And so why not unify in terms of the resistance as well? And, when we found the protagonist of this series, they were all working together in a coalition because even though their
mm.
experiences are different, there are similarities and learning and strength they can get from working together. So that's sort of why it's a series rather than a single story, is to show these intersections. Yeah.
Especially too like across I've been talking a lot with an organization called Protect Our Winners, which maybe I can't remember if we'd like shared over email that we had emailed about it all, but they work with Patagonia a lot too. They do a lot of work around activating the outdoor state is sort of like also very similar to this podcast of, there's all these outdoor enthusiasts across the country. Like, what does that mean to, and they're from different sides of the political conversation, right? Like we have folks who are very, very liberal who are outdoor recreationists. And then we also have folks who have conservative views and love to also be outside. Like this is kind of the unifying factor. And so Protect Our Winners does a really good job at building this broad base coalition, bringing people kind of to the center. But like, I think what you need is what you're doing is showcasing folks who, and maybe it's not even about politics, but just the show not tell thing, right? That we talk, like, I feel like is brought up a lot in storytelling of like, we're just going to showcase folks who are here's this one person, here's this character in this story, or here's this community working together on this issue. And yeah, I love that. I love the potential here to bring people, like for people to see themselves in the conversation, right? Maybe
Exactly.
they're watching, right? Like there's someone maybe watching the audience being like, oh, like I too am a like a what was it, like a cowboy rodeo cowboy? Like Addie am not a rodeo cowboy, but I wish that'd be very cool. But like someone watching and being like, I can see like myself or my community or someone I know kind of represented in these conversations. And I think that's like that to me is such a core part of what storytelling can do, is just open up the aperture on what representation means.
Yeah, I think, telling stories, well, also very character driven stories, beautiful stories, cinematic stories, so much
Mm,
environmental storytelling kind of, we say it's like eating your broccoli or whatever, but it doesn't have
yeah,
to be like that.
totally.
Like these stories are
Yeah,
incredibly dramatic, right? They're sort of like
yeah,
true crime stories, actually, when you think about it,
for
that
sure.
so
Yeah,
many of these industries can get away with so much harm and there's so little accountability because of the way our politics are, like who's
yeah,
paying the cost. But these are incredibly charismatic people who have powerful stories. And so we're really trying to approach it from like a storytelling first approach and really wanting to kind of shift or redefine, what a quote unquote environmental activist looks like. Even that word activist, I think, is
sure.
so supercharged
Yeah,
that it's probably not useful. I would just say these people who are standing up for their community, and I would say they're all like very aware of the climate and very concerned, but there's so many like immediate needs in Cancer Alley, right? To
yeah,
remediate and to take care of all the health problems and to be able to grow food there again. That's just an example. So yeah, it feels exciting to sort of, as you said, open the aperture and think about how do we tell a story that people can become part of. And, one of our goals is to really shift the narrative of what an environmental activist is and who gets to take that space. So much of the environmental like nonprofit space is big greens, right? But there's all of these
Yeah.
environmental justice, as you know, leaders around the country who often aren't getting as many resources. And we
Hmm.
would love to like, you know, help inspire there to be not just one Sharon Levine who's the protagonist of our first episode, but like hundreds, you know, in her community.
Mm,
Because the scale
yeah.
of the challenges that we have right now are so big that helping people
So
feel like they
big.
can become part of this story and that you might not have to go to like a protest and you know, like this horrible reductive idea that you're like wearing black and smashing a window, but maybe it's having a prayer meeting for the environment and coming together over love, or, you know, in Appalachia, like coming to a music jam. And that's one of the things I love, like when I see different ways that climate activism is getting done, for lack of a better word, across different cultural
Hmm.
social political context is it can look so many different ways. I have to like shout out Pacific Climate Warriors because they bring like their culture, their community, their
Yeah.
songs.
Yeah.
And, you know, if we're really going to build like a movement to turn the tide politically, I think we do have to have a broader image and idea of what it means to be part of this.
Totally. Yeah, they're so great. And if I'm remembering correctly, a friend of mine made a film about like a very, very short film about some of the activism that they were doing specifically. So
Cool.
we will link to that too. Like there, yeah, like to your point, like there's so many faces, right? Or like to use a representative word, faces or characters that we need to be talking about and representing in this space because like I love my co-host on the Trailhead, Faith Briggs, says the conservation space is white, male, and moneyed. And that is so real, right? Like that is so true. And it's not even just like I'm literally not talking about the oil and gas world, which is that as well, but like even like traditional, to your point, big green, right? Capital, like big green conservation is such a homogenous space. And I think yeah, we need to like kind of break that open and invite more folks in.
Yeah, and the storytelling space too, right? Like I
The
guess
storytelling
across
space too.
so many of the
Totally.
industries, it's so hard
Yeah.
to, yeah, to make it. But you know,
Yeah.
one of the lessons my team that's making versus Goliath has learned is that you don't necessarily need to wait for the big distributor or the big funder. Just go out
Mm,
and do it and like build your audience and get the right people and you can have a big impact. So like, you know, not waiting for someone to make give you the space, but just taking it.
totally. Oh, that's such good advice. I didn't, it wasn't even going to ask you for like, hey, what's your advice to storytellers or filmmakers? But that's kind of it, right? Like that could be such a good piece of learning that we share with folks listening. Like I needed to hear that too. You know, you just kind of need to start, don't get ready, get started, or what is it? Like, you know, just sort of put things out into the world. And yeah,
Yeah, and I mean, I honestly like I still am not the most advanced person with a camera or you know all of these things, right? That
sure. Yeah.
sometimes, you know, particularly men, I think, are like, oh, you're a filmmaker, and then they want to talk all about like gear
You're
or
like, what
something.
lenses to use? Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And I think I think my thing would be if you really have stories that you want to tell and you think they're really important to tell in new ways of exploring a place or an issue or something you care about, like having an idea and a commitment and an access and relationships is is so much more interesting and so much more important than like having gone to film school or having like a really
Yeah.
expensive camera. And I think when you think about social movements now today, it's not like the $20,000 ad. It's like the really authentic, raw story that catches fire and catches attention. So yeah, it is like I think a matter of you learn as you go, you get better as you go, but it's just a matter of like trying to muscle your way through it. And there's like tenacity in that. But if you're doing something that has value, I think something will work out.
It will rise to the top. Yeah. And, but I also appreciate what you shared about the community. Like in what you said, I also heard the community access and relationships too is so important because if you can't, I mean, I think my story, my aha moment, if you will, like is also a little bit of a learning lesson for me, at least, of like trucking in with my like lenses I didn't know how to use, etc., gear I didn't know how to use, but like putting a camera in front of an Indigenous leader and being like, okay, talk about, like, tell me about your, activism strategy. And they're like, not, no, like, that's not really, like, I just want to tell you like why I care about the land and the forest and the trees. Is that cool? And I was like, aha, yes, this is changing the way that I interview. This is changing the way that I story share, story facilitate, like, instead of the kind of like, we're going to tell this story on behalf of someone else. And you've always done that so well. The relationship creation with communities and again, facilitating story creation together, which you shared before too. But I think that's something that, like, I share that story to also be like, this is maybe how not to do. Like, I mean, of course, I feel like I came away with really amazing friendship, like truly friendships from that experience and relationships, but it could have gone a completely different way where they were like, what are you doing here? Like, why are you doing this to us? Like, that's not the way to do it. So you've always been so great at creating those connections. And I think that's really important to have too.
Thanks, Addie. Yeah, I mean, I would credit a lot of that. Like when I did come to Ashoka, I had already done quite a bit of oral history work.
Right, right.
And oral history is sort of all about the emergent story and trying to let go of your own assumptions and
Mm-hmm.
help facilitate space for genuine meaning making, reflecting, helping people, supporting people to explore their own stories in new ways. And I think that when you do that individually and collectively, it shows in whatever you're making. Like I use oral history to make films rather than having my
Mm.
idea. Like I feel like a document, it's this tough thing you have to apply for funding applications where you're like, this is the plot, this is the story.
Right.
But in
Yeah.
reality,
So
you know,
early.
you're gonna go on a hopefully like have an experience that will not be exactly as planned and predicted, and that will challenge you and change you, and including the people that you're
Yeah.
working with, hopefully in good ways. Sometimes it's really hard in all the ways, but yeah.
Yeah, totally. Maggie, I feel I'm going to ask my last question, even though again, this is a theme that I have with many folks, but I feel like we could talk for so much longer, given also that it's been literal years since we talked. So this is like catching up on lost time. I wanted to ask you what I ask everyone at the end is sort of this, like, what is your favorite climate solution that's not your own? And in this case, that might mean then like maybe that's not storytelling or that's not filmmaking. What is a climate solution in the world that you are very excited about, or that's kind of firing you up in this climate conversation we're in?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm gonna cheat and not totally follow
Do
your
it.
rules. I hope that's
Good,
okay.
good. That's
Um,
great. I love it. Go
so one
rogue.
of my very best friends, Thelma Young Lachinabua, and Rebecca Solnit wrote a book called Not Too Late. I don't know if you've read it yet. Um,
That
but
sounds familiar. Okay, we'll link to it.
yeah, so it's a book all about kind of reframing the climate crisis narrative. I mean, the title alone, Not Too Late, and it's a collection of essays, I'm sure of many people you know, some you don't, talking about climate and how we relate to climate and experience climate. And there's some really incredible wisdom in this book. And so I think the leadership of people who are sort of trying to shift how we even have the conversation to be one that's more regenerative, where we see possibility for like new connection, new relationship, new ways of being that can grow out of this. And yeah, it's really a brilliant book that has like deeply informed when I think about my own storytelling. I never want it to be doom and gloom, right? But more
Yeah.
oriented towards storytelling as a means to visioning and imagining what can be. And I just think it's a really beautiful project with a lot of incredible essays. So I want to shout them out
Cool.
for your audience.
That's great. No, I'm so glad you did. And this is my way of getting at, you know, maybe another typical question might be like, what advice would you give, or what like resource would you point to? I just asked the climate solution question because oftentimes, like more often than not, people are like, go check out this thing, like go check out this book or this, framework for building or creating in your community. And it's also often a really cool way to get at like a specific kind of like call to action, like go check this out. So thank you for that. I will definitely link to that. And it does sound, I know I've come across that before because it sounds so familiar. So
It's so
I
good.
will go find it for folks. Maggie, thank you so much for joining. This was delightful and really fun for me to get to hear how you're doing after it's kind of a reunion conversation. And thank you for taking the time amidst both travel for filming and film projects and also promoting films and going to Denver and launching your film and your series. So thank you for your time. And it was great to have you on.
It's such a pleasure. I love what you're doing. It's just great to be a small part of it, and hope the conversation keeps going.
Absolutely. Thank you.